Hello. In this session, we will talk about business rules and business rule validation exception. If you remember, in chapter 15, we discussed about custom exceptions. There we discussed if we are not building any library and building application software, then we should define only one or two custom exceptions. One exception, that is invalid request exception, we already defined in chapter 15. We defined it in application layer, which is responsible to throw exceptions at application layer. Similarly, in this session, we will introduce business rule validation exception in domain layer, which will be responsible to throw core business rule exceptions, or in other words, domain logic exceptions. Right now, we do not have very complex logic in our domain, but we can add one to our story entity. We can add does text contains bad words method to the story entity, which will responsible to make sure that text entered by the user does not have any bad words. If it is little confusing to you about what rules will go in application layer and what will go in domain layer, then you can always remember one simple rule that the logic which is crucial to business and must exist even if there is no computer application, that logic goes to the domain or business layer. For example, employee salary calculation, billing and tax calculation, student result calculation. These are few typical examples that will go in domain layer. To make sure that this check should always get executed, we will remove public accessibility of story set properties by declaring them as private. And we will introduce constructor which will be responsible to initialize the story object. And while initializing, it will always check if there are any bad words, then it will throw business rule validation exception. And if it doesn't have any bad words, then only it will assign that text to the text property of the story object. To handle this exception, we have to introduce catch block for business rule validation exception in error handler middleware, which will be responsible to return this exception as a bad request. It will use get business rule validation problem details method to construct the business rule validation problem details object. Business rule validation problem details object will have all the appropriate details for that exception. In addition to this, we will also do few refactoring, like we will have base entity class which will act as a base class for all entities. Also, we will introduce static class error messages to hold all error messages. Let us start implementing all this. Let us go to domain project and create folder seedwork. Add class business rule validation exception. This exception class should look like this, same as invalid request exception, which has collection errors to hold list of errors. Also, let us add entity class which will act as a base class for all entities. This class should look like this. Let us resolve this. Currently, we have only two properties in our base entity class, but we will add few more in future. Created at will always record current date and time whenever that object will get stored to the database. But instead of using datetime offset.now directly, we are introducing our own custom system clock class through which we will assign current date time to this property. This approach will make our unit testing easier. So let us add system clock class. System clock class will look like this. The advantage of using this class is that when required, we can pass some custom date and value to this class, which will be very useful approach at the time of unit testing. We will add one more class to seedwork, that is error messages. Right now we need only one error, detected bad words in text. This approach will help us to keep all error messages at one place and avoid hard-coded strings all over the codebase. Next, we will make few changes to our story entity. Now our story entity will be derived from entity class, which is in seedwork, and we already decorated our entity class with JSON object, so we can remove this from here. And id property is already there in the entity base class, so let us remove this also. Next, we want to add some business logic to this story entity, so let us add does text contains bad words method, which will be responsible to check bad words in the string. In real life, this will get replaced with actual bad words that we want to avoid. For demo purpose, I am using these dummy strings. Or instead of managing all this stuff by own, we can also consider using some third-party library for same purpose in future. As we want to make sure that this check should always get executed, we can make set accessor private so that from outside we will not able to assign any values to this object properties. As we are not allowing direct assignment to the properties, we need to provide constructor to initialize this object. So we will provide this parameterized constructor which will be responsible to initialize this object, and it will always make sure that this check has been passed before text is assigned to it. If this check is not passed, then it will throw business rule validation exception. While throwing this exception, we want to provide the reason, and here we are using that error message string. Next, we will need custom problem details class. We already have invalid request problem details class. Similarly, let us add business rule validation problem details class. This class will be derived from problem details base class, and it will look something like this. It will have one constructor. Let us resolve this. Next, in error handler middleware, we need to add another catch block to handle business exceptions. So let us add one catch block which catches business rule validation exception, and it will need one helper method which will actually build problem details object for this type of exception. So let us add this method at the bottom, and this object has all the appropriate details for exception which we want to report to the user, and this problem details object we will use in the response. One more change we need to do in create story command handler. As in existing code, we are using properties to initialize the story object, but now these properties are not publicly accessible. So we need to create story object using the constructor. So let us change this code like this. Now our update story command handler will break as it is using text property here. Now here we actually want to update the existing text of the entity. For that purpose, we can provide one public method in the entity itself. So let us add update text method here. And now in this handler, we can use that method. One small correction we need to do in business rule validation problem details. Instead of this, we simply need to assign this errors list in the exception to errors list in the problem details object. It should be semicolon. Also, instead of returning 409, for now I am returning 400 bad request only. We may change this in future. With these changes in place, we should able to compile it and test it. Run the project. Now let us try out post stories endpoint. If I will put some valid text, it should save it, and we should get 201 created response. Now let us try putting restricted words. So bad word 2 for example, and try to save this text, and you will get 400 bad request with the error details. So this is how we can report business rule violations. Let us stop here. If you find this content useful, please like and subscribe. If you wish to receive notification whenever a new episode is published, then do not forget to hit bell icon and click all option in the frequency drop down. Thank you.